Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Understanding Great Lakes Plastic Pollution, How Adopt-A-Beach Data Makes a Difference. I'm Jennifer Caddick, Vice President of Communications and Engagement here at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. So each year, Alliance for the Great Lakes Adopt-A-Beach volunteers clean up over 50,000 pounds of trash from Great Lakes beaches. The vast majority of it is plastic. How do we know that? Well, many people don't realize that in addition to keeping our beaches clean, our Adopt-A-Beach volunteers record and tally every single item that they pick up. And after each cleanup event, a volunteer team leader enters that data into our online system. This vast data set is used by researchers to learn more about plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. I'm very excited to be joined today by Tim Hoellein, an associate professor at Loyola University Chicago and a leading researcher on plastic pollution in the Great Lakes. He'll be sharing how Alliance for the Great Lakes Adopt-A-Beach data has informed his research and share some insights into the plastic pollution problem in the Great Lakes region. A little bit more about Tim. Originally from Edinboro, Pennsylvania, he completed a BS in biology from West Virginia Wesleyan College and a Ph.D. in biology at the University of Notre Dame. As I mentioned, he's an associate professor at Loyola University Chicago, where he's worked since 2010. His research focuses on the source, fate, and biological interaction of pollutants, including dissolved chemicals like nitrogen and phosphorus, and particulate material like microplastics and trash in urban aquatic environments. Dr. Hoellein's goals are to contribute to a greater understanding of freshwater ecosystems, incorporate students into research, and communicate results to colleagues, policymakers, and general public, which is a great thing that he's doing here today. Before we get into Tim's presentation, I just want to share a little, some housekeeping items. We are excited to have over 300 people registered for today's conversation. To reduce background noise for the duration of the event, participants will be muted. To ask a question, use the question box as shown here at any time during the webinar, and we'll leave plenty of time for your questions after the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. Also, everyone on this call and everyone who registered for the event will receive an email either later today or tomorrow with a recording of the webinar and any resources we share during the presentation. So I will turn it over to Tim, and Tim, let me give you presenter mode. There we go. Great.
Okay, does that look all right?
That looks great. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, and you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, all right. You think after a year and a half of virtual activities, we would have it down. It's always good to check. So I have a presentation for the group today, which is about trash on Great Lakes beaches. And we're really thinking about volunteer contributions to research and to solutions. So I'm so pleased to be here. I really appreciate the collaboration with the Alliance for the Great Lakes. I really appreciate the contribution of all of the volunteers that make this possible, and for all of you for attending. So I like to start with this picture. This is a cobra here. I pointed to it. That's bitten a python. And so as the python was dying of the venom, it strangled the cobra to death. So these two snakes killed each other. It's an amazing picture, right? This is fascinating biological interactions. I saw this online, and there was, of course, lots of chatter about this picture and what the snakes were doing, but this is zoomed in. And so actually, if you see the whole picture, these are the snakes, and they look like they're in maybe like a ditch or a dry stream bed, and the stream bed is filled with trash. And so you see pictures like this, and I think, is this kind of what we accept? We accept nature, biological interactions, ecological dynamics going on, and in the background, we kind of overlook the human interactions of all of this trash. And the thing is that we see so much trash, litter, plastic in our everyday activities that it becomes easy for that material to fade into the background, and you kind of stop seeing it. But in recent years, with an increase in research on the subject, public discussion, I think there's many of us who have started to re-see the trash that's kind of a part of our everyday life. And when you really look at it, there are some obvious questions that come up, which is, well, why is it here? Where is it going? And what's it doing? And so in my lab, the students and collaborators and I, we've been asking those pretty basic questions, which is, what are the sources, fate, and biological interactions of trash and plastic in freshwater ecosystems? And we're not the only ones asking this, of course. These questions are being asked all over the world, in urban areas, certainly, but even in some of the most remote places on Earth. This is an uninhabited island in the Pacific that's filled with garbage. And to take even a step back from this, this particular topic is really part of a broader concept. The term the Anthropocene era is something that's been introduced by geologists. And the idea is that the Earth is now in a new era, and the era is marked by a permanent human imprint on the geologic record. And so some future scientists could look back and see the changes that occurred at this time, because it'll be recorded in the sediments, it'll be recorded in the fossil record, in the atmosphere, and a part of that record is the trash that we're leaving behind. So this phrase, novel entities, is one of these kind of global change elements, along with loss of biodiversity, changes to the climate. Novel entities refers to all of the synthetic materials that we've created, especially in the last 100 years. So plastic, pharmaceuticals, and, a vast array of other chemicals that will persist for a really long time period. And so what I'd like to do today is just kind of walk through some points to talk broadly about trash and plastic litter, and then go through a few kind of take-home points from the research we've done on trash, especially that's been contributed by volunteers, and then end with what I hope is an optimistic take on this subject and a kind of philosophy of dealing with this concept. So first, just a bit broadly about trash. We use the term in the scientific literature of anthropogenic litter. This just means trash, things that people have created. The term anthropogenic is from people, and it's to differentiate natural litter, which might be like leaf litter or wood or sticks, which are sometimes also referred to as litter. So anthropogenic litter is trash, and there's all kinds of different trash. It's a wide variety of materials like plastic or paper or metal, all sorts of different sizes, from microscopic to derelict fishing vessels. And when we're talking about trash in the studies that we do, I'm thinking specifically of the macroscopic litter, the litter that's visible to the naked eye. We know that anthropogenic litter, which I've abbreviated AL here, to refer to as the trash. We know that this material has some important ecological and economic impacts. Organisms can interact with this kind of material in the environment. It can cause entanglement. Sometimes it's ingested, which has negative impacts. It's also a kind of novel mechanism for moving organisms around, like invasive species or microbes. And economically, we know that our communities incur a lot of costs related to dealing with litter and trash. It can affect tourism, and there are certainly direct costs to municipalities, counties, states to clean up after people. And I think one of the reasons this field of study has been emerging in the last 10 years or so is because people are seeing more trash in the environment, and the reason we're seeing more trash is because there's just more being generated. This is an assessment of plastic production from 1950 up to 2015 at a global scale. So the amount of plastic that's produced every year is more than the amount that was produced the year before, and that's continuing. This is separated by material type. So you might recognize some polymers like PVC, polyethylene, polypropylene. And because the amount of material we're producing is accelerating, the amount of waste, the plastic in the global waste stream, is also accelerating. So this is that same time scale, plastic waste production from 1950 to 2015. In this case, separated by sector. So you've got packaging, which includes food and drink packaging, and other things like electronics, textiles, construction materials, etc. And this particular field of study emerged kind of most prominently in the field of marine science. So people began observing trash, especially plastic, floating around in the open ocean on these isolated beaches where no one lives. And scientists began asking questions about where it's coming from and what it does and how it changes in the environment. And at that time, the field generally considered rivers or terrestrial environments as sources of trash and plastic to the oceans, which they are, certainly materials moving from land to the ocean. But as the studies have emerged more recently, in the last 5 years or so, we of course know that these are dynamic ecosystems in their own right. Plastic and other trash is retained on land, and it interacts with organisms in freshwater and terrestrial environments, and understanding those interactions is important. And even more recently, there's been a better understanding of how plastic can be distributed in our atmosphere. So this refers specifically to small particles, micro and nanoscale particles that can be kind of held aloft, moved around the world, and redistributed. So certainly we've grown from a field that was primarily based in marine science to now really having a global scale view on the issue of trash and plastic pollution. And research on the Great Lakes has made, I think, an important contribution to that global field of study. Because of the way we're kind of organized here and the types of population distribution we have and different biomes and land use types, we've been able to ask questions just to try to understand plastic pollution, but how land use, population density, things like flooding and seasonality, how those might affect plastic on the landscape and in our Great Lakes. Some initial estimates suggest about 11,000 tons of plastic per year are entering the lakes. I converted that to elephants, if that's a more useful unit, because it's hard to picture. And we use kind of like fundamental, oops, uh-oh, did I lose the screen? Could you see me? There we go. We use really just kind of our basic understanding of the Great Lakes and the terrestrial environment to understand how plastic moves. This is a model of microplastic movement in Lake Erie from Matt Hoffman at Rochester Institute of Technology. So there's really a well-developed field of hydrology and particle transport that we use for understanding natural materials that we kind of repurpose and apply those equations to novel materials like microplastic. And what this shows, I think, is that there's microplastic coming into the lake, certainly, and there's microplastic leaving the lake. It goes downstream to Niagara Falls and Lake Ontario. But there's also quite a lot that goes on in between. There's a lot of redistribution, suspension, sinking, and all sorts of potential interactions that can occur within the lake, separate from its just sort of transport through the lake. So with that context, I'd like to tell you just kind of a couple of take-home points from our research on trash and plastic pollution on the lakes. And this is made possible in part by the Adopt a Beach program. So the Alliance, of course, has been conducting this program for many years, where volunteers go out and pick up trash. And that in and of itself is like a wonderful exercise. But what's even sort of better for the purposes of scientific research is that the volunteers are given a data sheet, a tally form, where they write down what they find. They keep track of how many of the different items they collect. That data is summarized and posted online where it's available to be analyzed. So we have many, many volunteers to thank for this research. In our first study, we had kind of a basic approach. We picked 5 sites in Lake Michigan that spanned from, from north to south in the lake, but more importantly, a population density gradient from kind of most populated to less populated in the north. And we used a volunteer generated data to kind of just ask how much trash is at these places and during different times of year. And one of the key take-home points from all of these studies is that the litter is not evenly distributed in the environment. It's patchy, it's heterogeneous. And I think that this data shows that well. So we've got litter here. This is the y-axis. That's the amount of trash on the beaches. We've got our 5 beaches from Chicago up to northern Michigan. And we have data in spring, summer, and fall. And what this shows across seasons is that there's more trash in these more urbanized sites, maybe not surprising. And we find kind of unexpectedly more trash in the fall. And we attribute this to maintenance. You know, there's more people there, of course, in the summer, but there's also more litter collection that goes on through city, county programs which collect trash from the environment. So we think that this helps support that those programs are effective. And in the fall, when many of them stop, there's still people out there at the beaches, but the litter isn't being cleaned up, or at least not cleaned up as regularly. So both across the beaches and through time, we see high variation in the litter. Because of this incredible Adopt a Beach data set, we can actually look over longer timescales than 1 year and the seasons in a year. We can look over a decade or even longer. And that's what this data is. So this data specifically focuses on cigarette butts. If you've been to these cleanups, you know that cigarette butts are really one of the most abundant items that we find on our beaches. And this graph shows the proportion of litter that's collected by volunteers that is cigarette butts. And that's on the y-axis here, the amount of litter that's cigarettes. And then we've got time. So we've got about 2002 to about 2015. And for all the cleanups in Chicago, for example, we can show a decade or more ago, we were at about 40 to even 50% of all litter items were cigarette butts, but we see a pretty consistent decline in the amount of cigarette butts that are found as a proportion of total trash on the beaches. And that pattern is repeated for other places. You can see Evanston, Milwaukee, Gary, there's a decrease in the cigarette butts. This is consistent with national smoking rates, which have also gone down during that time period. And the credit for changing smoking rates goes to really a wide array of public education programs, policies about where you can smoke, how much it costs to smoke. All of these kind of collective actions have decreased smoking rates and have had well-documented positive impacts on public health. And what this unique data set can show, because of all of the volunteers, we can show a corresponding positive impact on the litter on our beaches, which is a decrease in the amount of cigarettes. So I could never do a study like this, but thanks to the resource that we have, we can accomplish it. All right, so litter is variable over time and across beaches. Another thing that we know is that it's moving around. You know, when you go to the beach and you see trash, it's kind of tempting to think that trash is stationary, it's there unless somebody picks it up. But in fact, there are natural factors that are changing where the litter is. We did this with a group of students in my lab. This is a beach that's adjacent to our campus at Loyola. So this is the northern neighborhood in Chicago in Rogers Park. So we had these transects they set up with some flags. These were permanently marked. And we had different habitats. There's a place adjacent to the beach. There's some vegetation. And the students went out every 2 weeks and collected any trash that was present on that 1 meter transect. And surprisingly, you know, you clean it and you go out 2 weeks later, there's plenty of more trash there. And in fact, these results, which show the amount of trash over the period of, you know, March to December, the amount of trash that's there, it changes. The amount of trash that appears at these places varies. We find more trash by the piers. We find it changes according to dates. A lot of stuff is reappearing in these empty transects. And we can scale up to this kind of patch of beach to say, this area is about 11,000 square meters. We found about 80,000 new items which appeared on these transects. So these are items that moved into the cleaned transect. So it's much more dynamic than you might imagine at first glance. Another way we looked at this is to go to, again, some of our beaches by our campus. This is nice because we can walk. And I had a class actually go out and collect trash along some transects. And in this case, they went to a couple of beaches and they collected the trash that was adjacent to these piers that stick out into the lake, and then another area on the beach where there wasn't a pier. And while they were picking up trash on these kind of defined pathways, they also picked up anything else that was there that was natural materials, so leaf litter, sticks, wood, algae, etc. And what we can find is across all of these transects, the amount of trash that we picked up, that's anthropogenic litter, was positively related to the amount of natural litter that's present. And a lot of those were accumulating in these sites right along the piers. So what we can take from this is to say, well, natural materials that have similar properties to trash, similar size, weight, etc. They're moving around. They get moved by wind, waves, other things, and they accumulate in these kind of predictable sites. And it turns out the trash is doing the same thing. So it's subject to the same forces of nature as natural materials. And that helps. That helps to know because we can direct kind of more efficient cleanups based upon that understanding. All right, third take-home point is that, again, from our assessments with the Adopt a Beach program, whenever we have Adopt a Beach activities with more people, we find more trash, which is to say, there's always more trash out there to be collected. So this is the number of litter items collected across many beach cleanups spanning our 5 study sites in Lake Michigan. And then this is the number of volunteer hours. It's just simply the number of people in the group times the amount of time that they spent in their cleanup. And what this shows clearly is that when you have more people spending more time, we get more trash. So there's always more. There's always more to collect out there. And I even tell people sometimes they might show up and think there's not much, but once you really start looking, it's surprising how much there really is. All right, and the last point here is about the composition. So we can look at the materials in these broad categories that are on the data sheet that the volunteers use. So they're tallying items, and the items are kind of grouped together into putative sources of litter or kind of similar material types. So some of the categories are food-related items, smoking-related items, waterway-related, which is like boating and fishing. And across our sites, in this study, we looked at sites in Illinois and in New York. We find the dominant materials are food and smoking-related items. And then we also find what's called small trash on the data sheet, which just means these are fragments that are kind of too small to identify what the original source of the material was. So this suggests, especially the food and smoking related items, that probably a lot of that trash is coming from people who visit the beach and they like to eat and drink and smoke while they're there. And that litter ends up behind. So if I could kind of summarize the points here, the trash that's out there, the plastic and other materials, is dynamic. It's unevenly distributed across our sites, and it's unevenly distributed over time because it's in motion and it moves in many ways that we would predict natural materials to move with similar density and sizes. Whenever we have more volunteers on these cleanups, we find more trash. And the composition of this litter from the graph I showed and others suggests that beach goers are probably a major source of trash to our beaches. So what do we do next? This Adopt a Beach data set is humongous. There's a lot of questions that we have. There's a lot of analyses that are possible that I just haven't been able to do yet. But I think given the data from the cigarette patterns, I think a data set like this is well positioned to examine some other impacts of public policy. There's a lot of changes going on related to plastic at the local, county, state, federal level that might impact the litter that's out there. And we can use this data set to tackle those questions, like maybe changes in policies related to plastic bags. Also in my group, we have other projects with similar kinds of questions. We want to know about flooding and microplastic. We're thinking about how government agencies might be able to do rapid assessments to determine how trashed an environment might be. And we do some experiments where we can add plastic to the environment in controlled settings to understand its ecological impacts. And then really critically, I'm interested in making sure that the data that we collect is available, that it's anyone who wants to see it for education, for policymakers, for anybody who's out there, that this data is our data collectively and can be used to make a positive impact. And in that vein, I'd like to leave with a couple of points about the philosophy. So I think it's important that we do this research, of course, because we spend a lot of time and energy doing it, because I think if we know the litter sources and which sites are most polluted, that puts us in a position to inform improvements like removal, like prevention. And the thing is that what our data shows is that the Great Lakes, of course, are different than the oceans. And one of the key differences is if you go to an ocean beach, that trash that could come from almost anywhere in the world. Litter is redistributed at a global scale in the oceans. In our environment, though, in the Great Lakes, it's not. We don't have that kind of scope of interaction. In fact, the trash that we find in our environment is from us, one way or another. That's trash generated by our communities in the US and in Canada. So we have a mantra here that if there's local sources, there's potential for local solutions. So certainly it's maybe disappointing to hear that we're trashing our own vital and critical resource. But it means that we can do something to solve it. A small island nation in the Pacific it would be hard for them to solve problems that are international in scope, but that's not the case for us. We can design solutions for our communities to help reduce the amount of trash that we see. And another sort of mantra we try to remember is there isn't a single solution to this. There's a lot of different materials out there and a lot of different activities which generate that material. And so to my mind, there's just as many possible solutions or maybe possible improvements to those items as there are materials. And so I think we have to think about solutions and activities that are an array, a diverse array of actions that are targeted perhaps at material types or activities. So for example, the cigarette butt decrease can be attributed to public education, lots of different policies about smoking. I think similar kinds of examples could eventually be given for other single-use plastic items, especially the ones that are current subjects of policy changes like plastic bag straws, styrofoam containers. I think, once we have that information, the data, we have the kind of teamwork mentality, we can explore all of the potential options that might be solutions. And these might be education policies like bans, taxes, or regulations, substitutions, and of course, innovations in material types. So this is the end here, but I want to say, I hope it's not too discouraging to hear this, but trash, plastic, and other materials is global. It's a global issue. It's all over the world. It's pervasive to all parts of the world, from our atmosphere to the deepest parts of the ocean. It's increasing, and on a scale of our lifetimes, it's permanent. It's a permanent feature of the environment. That litter also has impacts. It has impacts on the environment, and it has impacts on us. And so, I think when you kind of take in those points, it can feel overwhelming. It's like the scope of the problem is so big, it's daunting, and certainly it is. But I don't think that's a good place to end. I always want to feel like, yes, we can accept those facts, and then also accept a couple of other ones, which is to say that we're all collectively responsible for this material. You may not be throwing your trash on the ground, but it's more than that. Because we live in the culture of consumption, we perpetuate it, we are sort of a part of that economic engine. It is our litter. We're all collectively accountable for that problem. And what that means also is that everyone is a part of the solution. Every person is welcome to contribute to some solution, whenever they can, or to whatever capacity they can. Any action is a positive one, and it's one that makes a difference. Of course, the research is critical. If we know what's out there and how much and how it moves, that helps us be efficient in understanding policy changes and other actions. And I really think this is key, that improvements are possible. Changes in laws, kind of cultural attitudes, and individual behaviors can change. We've seen them change for things like microbeads in our soaps, like cigarette butts. So it's possible. It might take a while and it might take some effort, but I think we can make these improvements by maintaining a spirit of optimism, kind of constructive dialogue, and of making sure everyone's involved. So part of the Adopt a Beach program that I love so much is that it's really about community. Here's me with a group of students. I run these programs in the fall when we're here and we can clean up our beach. And I think, every person is welcome, but it's also nice because I think every person brings something unique and offers some perspective that's uniquely valuable. And it's that spirit of inclusion that I'm speaking about when I think about really generating solutions and steps forward as it relates to trash in the environment. So I thank all of those volunteers, of course, and make sure to thank the students and collaborators and funding sources that help contribute to this work as well. So let me stop here.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. That is super helpful. I have some questions of my own, and I also see a lot of questions coming in through the question function. So for those of you tuning in, you should see a little box on your screen somewhere that says questions. That's a great place to leave them, and I'm sorting through those, and we'll try and get to as many of them as we can with Tim.
Do you want me to stop sharing my screen, or should I?
Oh, sure,
up there?
probably, yeah. We could always reshare if we need to show something specific. Great, thanks. So I guess I also will start with a couple resources from the Alliance's end. I have a couple people asking, I see someone says that they sometimes do their own cleanup every time they go to the beach, on a daily walk or something, and asking if that is valuable data. We'll take whatever data you can get. And so you can just create a solo cleanup in our Adopt a Beach system. So it doesn't have to be a big group. It could just be you by yourself. It could be with friends or family. And so our website is greatlakesadopt.org. It's super easy to find an event to join or to create your own. And we'll take whatever data you can get. And kudos for you, to the commenter, for doing that each day on your walk. We appreciate that. I also have a couple questions here, which maybe we'll have a chance to get to, but just sort of asking about how to get some additional plastic reduction programs started in your own community. And the Alliance does have a toolkit called the Plastic Free Great Lakes Toolkit, which you can find at greatlakes.org/plastic-free. And that has some great tips for where you might start in your community if you want to do something more than Adopt a Beach cleanup, and getting at some of these ideas that Tim is talking about, which I think are great, about how we can all contribute to a broader solution. So some specific questions for you, Tim. I'm sort of flipping through here. I think I'll start with this first one, which asks, have any of your studies looked at the correlation between trash volume and garbage bin availability? I think they mean, if there are more trash receptacles or recycle bins at beaches, are you seeing a correlation, hopefully less trash left on the beach? I'm curious if you've had a chance to look at any of that in your data, your research.
We did early on. So in that study I mentioned, our first one, which had those 5 sites, we looked at the availability of recycling and trash bins, which are a part of the Adopt a Beach record. That might have changed in recent years, but some of the older data sheets, we could see those recorded, and we didn't find that correlation. Like the questioner, I was optimistic, assumed there might be, but I think the reason it wasn't there is because we see more of those receptacles in the Chicago, Gary beaches, and those are the places we find more trash. So it didn't work out. But what we don't have is how much of the trash went into the trash bin versus how much was on the beach. And it could be that they are effective in reducing the amount that's there, even though we still find more at those places.
I have a couple questions asking, which I'm going to sort of bunch these together a little bit. I know that you collaborate with a lot of other researchers around the Great Lakes region. And so I guess the question that I'll lump some of these together is, can you tell us a little bit about kind of that broader community of researchers, and how you connect with them specifically on studying Great Lakes plastic litter pollution?
Yeah, I mean, there are other people in the Great Lakes doing this work. There's not a lot, so I think we all kind of know each other. We know each other from professional conferences, from collaborations, from the kind of, the network of science that goes on. And so, yeah, we've worked together on writing papers. We think about how trash is moving through the lakes kind of together. It is less than the Earth, it's less than a global perspective, but it's still such a big place that it's hard for any one person to feel like they have expertise on the entire puzzle. So, for example, I mentioned Matt Hoffman, who's at the Rochester Institute of Technology. He's typically someone who's what we call a hydrologist. He knows how to do the math to understand how water moves. You can see it's complex from that video. There's a lot of equations behind there. But what I could do is we can take the measurements of the microplastic in the water. And so by combining that data with the knowledge of the kind of complex water movements, we can create something cohesively. And the same is true for other researchers. There's some at Penn State Barron in Erie, up in Lake Superior, at Wisconsin Superior. And everyone brings, something to the table, and collectively we're of course better than we are individually. One of the things I've liked about that research is I find there really is a positive spirit. There's a real spirit of collaboration among those scientists because there's so much to do, and anytime we can work together to ask those questions, I think we feel like we're doing a better job. Does that answer your question?
I think so. Yeah, that's awesome. I see a clarifying question here. This is getting to some of the specific data that you showed about cigarette butts. And so the question is asking if cigarette butts have decreased in absolute numbers or just as a portion of trash.
We have the same exact question, and the answer is both. But the challenge with the Adopt a Beach data is we're dealing with volunteers. We're dealing with thousands and thousands of volunteers who have varying degrees of attention, of specificity. We like to think that we know the area that they're covering on the beaches, but we don't exactly know the areas. And so we, in the case of dealing with these large data sets from so many volunteers, we have to rely most on the proportion data rather than the absolute number, because it's not like me and my students are out there and we're very meticulous at kind of crawling along the sand and a certain area where we can't necessarily make that conclusion as strongly. So I appreciate that question. It's something we've struggled with, but it's both, but the percentage number is the one we feel is most robust.
Got it. Let's see here. Oh, I just had a question and I lost it. Oh, I do have here it is. There's a specific question about balloons. I know there's been a lot of media attention over recent years about, people releasing balloons and then they go float away and land somewhere. Just asking about how much balloon pollution we see in our litter data. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, Tim. I know it isn't a huge amount, but I don't know if you have any particular thoughts on the balloon issue and how it shows up in our data or not.
Yeah, it shows up. It's a category on the tally sheet, and it's really I would say it comes up in most beach cleanups, but it's not that many. You know what I mean? So it is common, but it's a small number. The thing is about balloons is we find the balloon as well as typically like strings, and so there's a worry about entanglement when it comes to balloons specifically. Like they could be ingested, they could entangle something, and so while they might be a small number, they present a hazard. So this is one of the things we consider with our beach litter data as well. We know some things are very abundant, but maybe less hazardous, whereas other things are not as abundant, but present a real hazard. And the things that we would put in that category are things like balloons with the strings. Also, we find medical and sort of like drug use waste. It's not a lot, but we do find that's out there and could be a potential source of disease or of injury to people and to animals. And then there's things like shotgun shells, other materials like that, of course, that represent a danger. So those are all low in proportion, but key for public safety and environmental safety.
Yeah. There's a great question here about just the idea of reducing single-use plastics and the impact on the disability community. And so the question says single-use products and single-use products and plastic products can be extremely helpful and sometimes critically needed for disabled individuals. How do you propose inclusive public or plastic policy for those with disabilities? And how can we address plastic pollution without taking away the independence that plastic products can provide for disabled individuals? And I think that's such an important question. The Alliance addresses that in that plastic-free Great Lakes Toolkit. And one of the things that we really advocate for is moving away from some of the individual solutions, like just banning plastic bags or straws or whatever the single item might be, but thinking more holistically about our plastic policies and how governments, whether it's a city, a state, federal government, can address those. And also making sure that we have as many different voices at that policy-making table. Making sure that the disability community and anyone else impacted, which is all of us, at the table for those conversations as we develop public policy, so that we're really developing policies that are inclusive and really getting at that broad goal that I know we all share about reducing plastic pollution, but trying to figure out a way that it's equitable for everybody. So that's the Alliance for the Great Lakes perspective, but Tim, I don't know if you want to weigh in on that issue or question at all either.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, when I speak about inclusive, the thing is, I think we're making better decisions when we hear from everybody and when all of those voices are a part of the conversation. And certainly we don't want any changes to negatively impact any communities, disabled or otherwise. It also brings to mind some of the conversations that have gone on internationally that relate to bottled water. There are some places in the world where bottled water in plastic is an issue of public health, where otherwise access to safe drinking water isn't possible. And so banning or removing access to safe drinking water is not something anybody wants to do as part of the intent to solve plastic pollution. And so there is a environmental justice issue that's kind of embedded throughout this conversation that I think is so important to include when it comes to talking about solutions, and that relates to certainly disabilities, health needs, and then also class issues related to class and wealth and all of the disparities that go along.
Yeah, excellent points, Tim. I see a couple questions here about the past year and a half or so that we've gone through with the pandemic, and people asking if we're seeing an increase in PPE on our beaches, masks, etc. We certainly, I have to say, we pared way back on the Adopt a Beach program last season just out of safety concerns, and we're starting to get in the data from this year, and we are seeing more of that kind of thing. We never had things like masks on our litter forms before, or even thought about that as a potential litter item on beaches. But Tim, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what you might be seeing just in your day-to-day work on this.
Yeah, like you, our work has been really scaled back. So everybody else, we're working from home, we have limited access to the kind of teamwork and students that are necessary to ask these questions. So we're behind in terms of the analysis and the research, definitely, just because of staffing. But this has been documented. So other people have found this, other people who have been able to get the analysis done and out elsewhere. There's a lot of data sets out there like this one. So there's the Ocean Conservancy. There's also Keep America Beautiful that does a lot of litter cleanups and has these data sets out there and people are analyzing. And the answer is yes, there's been more face masks, gloves, PPE, maybe lumped together, found at least in 2020. We'll see if that persists into this year. I'm not sure if we'll capture it with this data set because the numbers were so much lower of what was possible during this year. But if it does persist into 2021, then perhaps we'll be able to detect it.
Yeah. Related to the sort of the past year and a half of COVID times, as some people call it, specifically in the city of Chicago, all last summer, the beaches were technically closed to reduce large gatherings and so on. And we have a commenter that notes that was a pretty significant natural kind of experiment to see what would happen on our beaches from all kinds of angles. And I know our teams were not able to access Chicago beaches, but Tim, I don't know if you were able to get out there and take a look or see if you had any insights on, the person is asking if we could measure trash data during that time. Like I said, our teams couldn't, but I don't know if you have any insights on that.
Yeah, I mean, we didn't leave the city either, but I did have, with my class in October of last year, 2020, we went out, we were able to get permission to go on the beach and measure litter. And so we have that data sitting around. I don't have the results yet, but one of the things we noticed was there was a lot more natural litter. There was a lot more leaves and sticks and things than we normally find on the beaches. And I think that has to do with traffic, with people being out there, with maintenance that was much reduced from the city parks. And so I agree, this is a kind of a really fascinating natural experiment where we might have less trash and more natural litter, and that natural litter is important for the environment. It fuels insects and fish and other things. So I don't know if we'll have the data to do it because we just weren't allowed to get there, and there were police, patrolling the access. So we'll see if we can get the numbers.
Yeah, the beaches were literally blocked off with the police officers saying, do not go, which was a good thing for public health, I think. I have a question. We're sort of heading up on the edge of our time here, but I'll add in one or two more questions because we've got a lot, which is great. Thank you to all of you for sticking with us and joining this conversation. There's a question here about Nerdles. I'll let you explain what those are, but asking if, I know in the Alliance perspective, I don't know if we have a whole lot of data on Nerdles and where they're coming from on Lake Michigan beaches. So Tim, can you explain to us what the heck is a Nerdle and if you have any data on that?
Yeah. A Nerdle is a pellet. It's like a pre-production pellet for plastic manufacturing. So if someone wants to make a plastic toy or other plastic items, they often will buy these pellets. They look kind of like flattened discs a little bit, and they're called virgin plastics or pre-production pellets or Nerdles. And the idea is those are molded, kind of melted and molded into larger plastic items. So at plastic manufacturing facilities that receive a whole bunch of these pellets or Nerdles, they can escape into the environment. And we find them all over the place. So we do a lot in the rivers here. We find Nerdles in the river really every time that we go. We find them on the beaches all the time as well. This particular item is not recorded in the Adopt a Beach data set because it's kind of lumped as the small items. But sometimes people will note that in the notes section, but it isn't something we have rigorous data from Adopt a Beach. But we find them all the time on our beaches. And there was a large study of Nerdles, or those pre-production pellets, that went on in Lake Huron by a group in Canada. The researcher's name was Patricia Corcoran. And they found that the plastic Nerdles were associated with the manufacturing industries kind of along the southern part of Lake Huron there, and were kind of distributed along the beach according to proximity to those potential sources, but then also moving down through the Detroit River and so on. So they're a ubiquitous feature of our ecosystem. It's funny because you don't always see them. They look, most often they're white and they're small discs, and you might mistake them for something natural like maybe a seed or a piece of a plant or something. But once you do see them, they really jump out at you. So you might observe them on our beaches.
You know, one thing I hear most often from our volunteers, and you mentioned this a little bit, is that, and I've even seen volunteers who sign up for a cleanup event, show up at the beach, and they're almost a little disappointed because there isn't a lot of visible, like right off the bat, visible trash. But those little small pieces, once you get to looking, I have so many people come, we have people come back after an event and they say, once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? Once those little pieces are out there and you start picking through and realize just how much is out there, it's pretty incredible. I will also, I would be remiss if I didn't note that Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois actually has legislation in Congress that would regulate, I guess you would call it Nerdle pollution, so those little plastic pellets, to make sure that they are not getting into the Great Lakes the way that they are now. So you can learn a little bit more about that on Senator Durbin's website, and so on. So it's great that somebody's starting to tackle that issue. So with that, I think I'm going to have to wrap up our conversation. We're a bit over time. Thanks for sticking with us, Tim. And thanks so much to everyone for joining us. Again, Tim, we just greatly here at the Alliance for the Great Lakes really appreciate your partnership, and it's so exciting to see our data sort of come alive. You know, all these years that volunteers have been cleaning up, and that data really does help make a difference in our understanding of this problem in the Great Lakes, and ultimately starting to inform some solutions. So thank you so much, Tim, for sharing all that information with us today and taking the time for us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. The collaboration has been so rewarding, and I really appreciate everyone at the Alliance and all the volunteers that are out there doing it. And we continue to do the cleanups also. So being out there on the ground is such a positive experience. So hopefully everyone gets a chance to, now that our world has opened back up a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. And one final plug, I will send details on this in the wrap-up email, but don't forget for all of our viewers, on September 18th is our annual September Adopt a Beach event, which is our one really big day of action for the Great Lakes. It's tied to the International Coastal Cleanup, and so the people around the entire world get together and do cleanups on that day. So certainly keep an eye out. That this year's September Adopt a Beach event marks our 30th anniversary of Adopt a Beach, which is really exciting. But you can find, there are tons of cleanups on greatlakesadopt.org. So you can find one if you're not interested in September 18th, want to get out there right now, you can find one in your neighborhood or start one of your own. So we'll send more details about all that along with a recording. Again, thank you, Tim, and thanks so much to everyone for joining us. Have a great day. Bye-bye.